A very good afternoon to everyone who is here. Very good to see so many people here today. 30 on the list at the moment, and I think there will be more people joining in. I'm Kwong Nui. I will be the moderator for the panel discussion today. I'm a senior lecturer at AUT, and yes, so welcome to Auckland. Day 80 lockdown. So it's great to see our panelists are all here, Claire, Steve, and Stephen, and I will ask them to introduce themselves in a minute. But before that, as you can see, this session will be recorded. So if you would like to turn off your camera, feel free to do so. And we do have live transcription if you want to have live transcription on as well. But as Kristina mentioned just now, this transcription will be review before it when it goes public. So without further ado, let's introduce our panelists today. So Claire, would you like to introduce yourself and say a few words?
Kia ora, ko Claire Amos toku ingoa. I am the Tumuaki or principal at Albany Senior High School, and whilst I do come from that sort of within a school to leadership role perspective, I've also had a wide range of roles sitting on things like the Education Council. I sit on the board for NetSafe, work with the advisory group for Network for Learning, and I've sort of had a long history of enjoying sort of national and local technology and educational leadership roles.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you for being here, and we look forward to hearing more of your sharing from the school sector. Steve.
Kia ora, everyone. My name is Steve Leichtweis. I'm from the University of Auckland. I work in Ranga Auaha Ako, which is our central learning and teaching design unit, which is out of the Provost's office at the university. I have been in this role for about 5 years, but I've been in Auckland for about 8, and before that University of Waikato and Sydney and a couple of other universities before that. So been in higher education for a while and been doing this role for quite a long time as well, and have really enjoyed the opportunities that the COVID lockdown has presented to Auckland and what that represents as change as we look forward as an institution.
Yes, hi Steve. Thanks for being here too. And lastly, my former colleague, Stephen.
Hi everyone. Hi, I'm Professor Stephen Marshall. I'm the Director for the Centre for Academic Development at Victoria University of Wellington, and Wellington's underlined and big and bold if you ask my VC. And I've been here for a very long time. I've also been past president of the Australasian Council of Open Distance and eLearning, so very actively engaged across the sector in terms of the long-term shape of higher education and the role that technology plays through a whole variety of different pieces of work over the last couple of decades. So yeah, looking forward to having the conversation with colleagues today. See a few faces both from Victoria and from around the sector that I know well in the audience. So great to talk to you all.
Thank you, Stephen. And yes, I do miss Wellington. Yeah, so welcome everyone to today's session, Equity and Inclusion in Flexible Learning Challenges Across the Sectors. So as you can see, Claire is representing school sectors and national, local settings. Steve and Stephen working at 2 different higher education institutions, and both have international knowledge as well on this aspect. So to get us started, there's one question, but for all the audience, if you have question or feedback, just feel free to put in the chat or turn on your microphone and feel free to jump in. Otherwise, I will just keep going through the questions and the discussion points for today's session. So first of all, and see who would like to start first, Claire, Steve, or Stephen. In your opinion, how equitable and inclusive are our education sectors, given your role within your context?
I'm happy to kick off with the secondary context, and then we can work our way up. So I think the answer is not very. We have a really wide and deep digital divide which means that we have a really wide and deep divide when it comes to flexible learning and the access to it. My concern is that at present, the fate and the futures of our young people is in the hand of specific school leaders, and it really does rely on their personal depth of understanding of the issues and the abilities to co-design a localised solution to what is actually a really complex problem. And we've got a bit of an issue, I think, in the secondary space, in that the Ministry of Education has had sitting in the background a digital strategy that sat there, and I've been involved in at different points in time, but it sort of languished a little bit in the background. And I'm really interested to see where the national digital strategy that is being worked on at the moment, how that might refire up the focus on a specific Ministry of Education digital strategy that can support our schools. The rolling lockdowns in Auckland really highlighted the vast continuum of our school leaders here, and their understanding and their preparedness or lack of preparedness for delivering equitable, inclusive teaching and learning experiences online. And it's about understanding an experience that goes beyond just the provision of a device. You know, we had schools that did solve that part of the equation, but actually, if you don't understand how to design engaging and inclusive learning experiences that are informed by things like universal design for learning, nor do you understand how to balance the focus on the academics and sustaining the well-being of your students and staff, it can fall really flat. And what I think has happened is that people struggled to get it going in the first place, and they often did it in a way that was ineffective. And we saw that coming through in things like the data that came through in the OECD and the PISA reports around what effective teaching and learning looks like. You know, it's not that e-learning isn't effective, it's just that it isn't effective if you don't know how to do it effectively. You know, the tool is only part of the issue. And I think what happens when it isn't done effectively is that as soon as we come out of lockdown, people default back to the status quo. And so whilst we have seen some real steps forward and some real school communities that have leveraged this opportunity and done really well, we've also seen schools that have done it to a middling level and then have slipped back into very traditional modes and methods once they have had an opportunity when they've gone back face to face.
That's a very interesting point. Yeah, like how the digital technologies are being used and the change of behaviors is within a spectrum. So
and everyone here knows that it's not just about the technologies and the tools; it's the actual kind of learning that.
It's about the doing, I suppose, and how people actually take it. That's a very interesting perspective. And how about Steve and Stephen, who would like to jump in?
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in. I'm less confident that the digital strategy will help us because of my observations of how the sector is being shaped and framed and the priorities that the government through its agencies are choosing to privilege. And this is directly relevant to the sort of the equity and the inclusion debate, because it's one of the things that I use in my own work is a sense of stakeholder salience and who it is that gets to define the parameters of how a system is operating. And it's abundantly clear that the ministries and the government have been captured by a very economically rationalist view of how they believe an education system should enact itself. And that's directly counter to genuine equity and inclusion, because that privileges an economic system and it privileges measures of success that are themselves inherently unequal in their outcome. And until the government is prepared to recognise and work in partnership with a much wider range of people as key stakeholders, and believes that education is something that exists throughout lives, right from cradle to grave, they're going to pick winners and losers, and that inherently is an unequal situation. But I think also, and this is sort of implied by the focus on things like devices and device strategies and the sustaining of what we do, it's really important, I think, to position how we're talking about equity and inclusion from understanding basically what I call context, input, process, outcomes, and feedback. So essentially, you have to start by saying, well, who do we as educators believe our students are. Where do we see them, and where are they coming from? And also reversing that, what do they see of us? How do they see us, and how do they perceive us as being spaces that welcome them and bring them in and have value to them in their lives? Then you think about what it is are the barriers to input. How is it that people can enter into that space, and what is it that enables people to start to engage well and not to disengage at that point of entry? Then you can think about the experience of learning. What is it that happens during the time that you're engaged in learning, and hopefully that isn't just a discontinuous process for you. Is that something that responds to who you are as a person and helps you and challenges you to be more effective? Then do we see evidence of an equity of outcomes? And recognizing that in the university sector, we have to acknowledge that our goal is intellectual excellence. And so equity of outcomes is inherently somewhat challenging for us in terms of understanding what leads to that excellence in intellectual spaces. But it's pretty clear that we've got definitely some room to go. But we also need to think about the higher education space in terms of that equity of outcome more broadly than a single provider and a single model of what education might look at. So everyone always successful in every way for everybody in every system is unachievable, and we need to be pragmatic about that. And then finally, the feedback component is, how do we enable diverse people and other diverse viewpoints to be exercised and to have impact on the system, to exercise agency, to exercise ownership of its shaping into the future in ways that are productive and strengthen that wider sector, rather than dividing it and damaging its capacity to do really important things for New Zealand society. So yeah, big, interesting, hairy challenges for a country to grapple with.
Yeah, I agree. I think the conceptions itself of equitable and inclusive is still waiting for more clearer definition, I suppose, let alone there are quite a lot of variables that Stephen has just mentioned. Steve?
Or leadership. I mean, we're still waiting for leadership in this space. So I'll take, I completely agree with where Claire and Stephen have gone with their introductions, and I'll add maybe more of a practical or process approach from a university or an institutional perspective. So in response to your initial question, as a large research-intensive university that has historically prided itself as a campus-based learning space or environment, we're about as equitable as we need to be, or as inclusive as we need to be in our digital spaces. And to be blunt, like Claire was right at the get-go, that's not very much. I guess the way to think about it from the perspective coming from our perspective is that on a year-to-year basis or on a quarterly basis, the senior level decision-making folks within our university, they receive a lot of high priority requests and initiatives and programs, and then they have to figure out how to spread very small amount of butter across a very large piece of toast. And so when there's no, when you're dealing with that kind of budget constraints, typically what happens is you assess the risks of not doing that initiative in this this calendar year or this budget year. And things that don't have a sting in the tail, like a punitive outcome for non-compliance, tend to be pushed down the road. And we won't engage with them unless there is leadership at a higher level, which in our case is the New Zealand government, actually saying here is a negative or a punitive outcome if you don't engage and provide a much more equitable or inclusive learning space for all students. And it's nice, I guess, even though it's a bit slowly in kid gloves. TEC has released a new disability action plan requirement where universities do have to have a very detailed action plan around disability, which covers equity and inclusion for the tertiary sector. And I think by 2024, there are going to be negative funding outcomes for higher education institutions that do not comply and have a very detailed disability action plan. And, we at Auckland, we do have a office for the Provost of Equity, and they've spent the last few years developing a disability action plan. And we've got a lot of work. That document is huge, and it covers physical and digital learning spaces, as well as our physical assets, the buildings that people access, and the processes and strategies and policies that make that all work. It's a huge amount of work. And, even the news last week where the government set up the very first kind of office for equity, there's opportunity for that to grow and actually get to the point where maybe New Zealand has legislation similar to what Australia has, similar to what America has with the ADA rules. And that's the kind of drivers, it's great to ask people to make sure that you're providing an equitable space for all students. But unless you have the right incentives or legislation saying here is a negative outcome if you do not provide this, many people will be in a very similar position to us, where we can just say the risk of not engaging is not high enough for us to actually take the time to really address the issue.
Cool. Yeah, thank you, Steve. Yes, I think leadership plays a role in all the decision making or the impact on any strategy or policy or the ways we are going to do things. But on that note, and Steve, I think you mentioned a little bit in your greeting about the current global pandemic situation. So my next question is, to what extent do you think did the global pandemic have an impact on equity and inclusion in flexible learning?
It did a brilliant job. It also did a horrible job. Obviously, as a university that has really been solidly marketing and pushing itself as a campus-based learning experience, the move to remote emergency learning and teaching was a wake-up call for our teaching staff. But I think Claire was chatting even before we started the recording that the experiences of many staff who didn't have the teaching presence or the practice in the digital space, their experience of remote emergency learning in an environment where we don't have the tools, they don't have the disposition, they don't have the comfort facilitating in digital learning spaces. That gives us a change management problem where the staff will want to revert to what they know, the comfortable space where they've been habitating for how many decades. But at the same time, it's really highlighted some major risks for our institution if we don't up our game. And with a new vice chancellor and a new provost and even a new chancellor, we have a really good opportunity, and we're in the midst of reimagining what Auckland is as we move forward in the learning and teaching space, and we're solidly putting our hat in the ring for blended and online delivery to help subsidize what will become more of a sticky campus, is what they're calling it, and where if the students do choose to come on campus, they're coming on for high value, really active relational opportunities to learn with their peers and with the teachers who are part of that physical delivery of portions of the course.
Yeah. How about you, Claire? Anything to add on based on what you have said as well?
Yeah, but building on the back of what Steve has said, I think what it actually did is it shone a light on the inequities, and it actually, the pandemic has actually caused a chasm to widen and harden, and with each consecutive lockdown, we've seen it actually overflow into those students who were disengaged throughout their lockdowns were then disengaged often when they came back to school, and we had increased absenteeism. We have schools and communities where they struggle to re-engage. We had incredibly high engagement over lockdown here at Albany Senior High School because we're built, flexible learning is in our DNA. So we just flicked a switch and we were fine. And we managed for the most part to keep up really good connection and relationships and have very relationship focused approach throughout lockdown. Our kids re-engaged immediately. Those communities where the kids were disengaged, we had 80,000 households in New Zealand representing 100,000 students without access to a device. And we know that the device isn't the only thing that matters, but without a device, you can't do the other stuff. So when you've got that many young people without even the basics and having the option to be having access, and then we've got the issue of not having the Wi-Fi, having limited bandwidth, only having what's on their cell phone, able to access it. You can't do the hard work in terms of getting the other stuff right. And so it became a real postcode lottery. And I think the pandemic served a really important, it both shone a light, which was in some ways terrible, as Steve said, because it highlighted the haves and the have-nots and the challenges that we have in our system. But I think it also did us a real favour because we can't shy away from the fact that this chasm, this divide exists in our society. And so, I'm hoping that it results in us stepping up. And I agree with Stephen that this, I also don't have trust in a digital strategy because I was involved in 2013, 2014. I was part of a team that put together the future focused learning and connected communities paper. We put together a raft of recommendations for the government to implement that was designed to close the digital divide, look at the teaching and learning, look at all the stuff that goes with it. And we had a change of government and it got thrown out. The baby got thrown out with the bathwater. And that's the real risk that we have. This stuff is too deeply politicised. We need this stuff. We need a strategy that rises above being a political volleyball. And I've been shocked as someone who is would pride myself on being a bit of a raving lefty-leaning educator. I have been shocked at how little this stuff has been prioritised and worked on in the last few years. I would have thought if we do care about our people and we want to be kind and we want to make sure that everyone has what they need, actually we need to get on and close this digital divide and do the work that then has to happen after we've done that.
Yeah, and I think I think I would say that it is equally viewed by both political parties, and they're equally bad at how they view it. So I actually think if National had stayed in government, I'm not convinced that the outcome would have been any different either. No. And the problem here is that the political perception of the higher education system in New Zealand is very much defined around the idea that it is a personal benefit, and that this is something in which private incentives and business activity should dominate, and the market will lead to the right outcome. And so I worry, and I hear what Steve's saying, and I'm thinking here particularly in the context of the Code of Pastoral Care. We have governments and we have agencies that are very comfortable with direct manipulation of the sector without carrying the cost and the responsibility and the accountability for what's achieved in that. So they're very happy to tell people what they should be doing. They're very unhappy to invest in the resources needed to enact that well. And that's a key difference between New Zealand as a country and even Australia, where several times they've had quite substantial agendas in the educational space, and they directly invest additional money into that space, recognizing that even if the business as usual state is what's being funded, there's always a cost of the change. There's always a burden to take the sector through a change process. And if you don't pay for that, then unless you're very lucky and you manage to get all the way through that change process because of a crisis like a pandemic, the natural behavior is to retreat back to what happened before, simply out of a resourcing problem. And that's a mental energy issue as much as it's actual resources, people on the ground, systems, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I think it's, for me, one of the great ironies in this space is, and setting aside clearly issues around digital divide, and coming at this from a university perspective, COVID's great. COVID has done a number of things that are actually spectacularly good for access and equity for the people who are in the university system. We get a lot of feedback from our disabled students and from even our normal student body that there are many aspects of what's happened in the last couple of years they very much like, and they would very much like us to keep going. Most of our disabled students are having a much better experience of our courses at the moment because they can be in an environment that is customized to their needs. Exactly, that's their home environment or where they might be, and yet gain access equitably to exactly the same resources and experiences that every other student is getting. They're not being accommodated. They're having a mainstream experience. And for many of them, the tools that they use to do that are very well suited. We don't have the ADA in New Zealand, but we buy US sourced materials and tools that are ADA compliant. So our tool set is great for those students, allowing for the fact that they have to have the necessary resources to be there in the first place. But interestingly, this is helping for those resources as well. I mean, Wellington has a hideously high cost of living. Accommodation costs are horrendous. Transport costs are horrendous. So for our students, the opportunity to do their learning from another place where the cost of living is just cheaper, where they don't have to have the burden of spending hours in the day going through public transport, where they can transition quickly from learning activities to personal family care or caring responsibilities or work responsibilities without a high transition cost between that time in their day. Those are things that directly make things better for many of our students. That said, we've had real challenges with some groups, and the problem with the device conversation, and we started asking this question a few years ago of our students and very quickly settled on a question that wasn't merely, did you have a device that you could use for your learning? So we stopped asking, can you access a laptop? Because it turns out that the laptop you could access was your parents' one that was a work one that you couldn't use for anything. We started asking, have you got a device that you can use for extended periods for your learning in an environment in which you can, in fact, undertake that learning? Because this is the thing that really starts to come home for some of the economically disadvantaged groups in New Zealand, in that it's not you by yourself, it's you plus 3 or 4 other children, parents, all trying to undertake learning activities in very cramped, compromised living environments. And we even see this in the workplace, where the number of us that are now used to doing video-based meetings and conversations, but you have to be somewhere where you can do that. I have the privilege of being in a private room by myself. I can talk as loudly and as actively as I want to as part of this conversation. I'm not disturbing other people and they're not disturbing you, but that's really not something generally available. So it's a much more complicated problem than simply technology. And it's also, like everything, it's got good and bad to it. So yeah, it is interesting in that respect. And all of these issues predated the pandemic. It's just that the pandemic has removed some of the things that made it easier for us to pretend that they really weren't present in the space. It's made it much harder to deny this stuff. And also, of course, everybody has become less well. Everyone is subject to a lot of stress, either directly themselves or through people around them. And that's made them much more fragile and less capable of dealing with things not being exactly as they would want them to be. So that really remains a significant problem for us, I think.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Stephen. I'm conscious it's halfway through the discussion, and I may want to give the audience a chance if you have any question or comment at this point, because it has been quite quiet on the chat.
I will respond or add to Stephen's comment about how the pandemic has made things more equitable, but with a bit of a sarcastic tone, because I think it's equally bad now for all of our students in the digital space, certainly.
Yeah. Sue just make a comment on the chat. I wonder if Claire, Steve, or Stephen has anything to say about that.
I'm just about to drop a response quote into the chat. There we go. This is on the bottom of every single email that comes out from me. It's a reference to Michael Fullen, who makes a similar point to Sue, and I do want to acknowledge that. But I think that we have to be uneasy in this space, Sue. I want people to be concerned and engaged and uneasy, because then we're going to try and find solutions. My biggest, the diagnosis I have of the university system is it is complacent and arrogant and comfortable. And so I want us to be uneasy. I want us to be thinking about things that provoke us. But I think it's really important to think about, particularly in a country as small as New Zealand, we shouldn't be solving these problems single provider by single provider. And if we're not prepared to think in that space, then the government will do ham-fisted things like they've done with the polytechnic sector and simply shut down any capacity to discover new pathways by the sector and impose on it a rigid, hierarchical, very limited scoped view of what it is that a tertiary education system does. And we're seeing similar behavior with their talking around and regulations around micro-credentials. So they're framing micro-credentials in a very, very narrow and quite limited way. Yeah. And I'm sorry, I absolutely do not accept that people in NZQA or TEC or the Ministry of Education have any clue whatsoever of what we could do with a micro-credential-like thing in New Zealand society. They are not experts, they are not practitioners, they are at best observers and consumers, and I'm angry at what they do in that space.
And I wanted to add to that, and this actually sort of, I know you've actually got, this is the sort of answers the next question that I think you're going to ask us, but I want to build on that idea around the changes that do get prioritised often represent quite an interesting view of the concepts of what it means to be equitable, i.e., I think we have a really big ongoing challenge in New Zealand's education system. At the moment, we're undertaking the NCA change package, which is affecting the qualification framework in secondary schools, and we are undertaking an NZC, New Zealand curriculum review. In both cases, there's a really interesting idea that, and you touched on this earlier, Stephen, that equitable outcomes are achieved when everyone achieves the same, in essence. So the way that they sort of try and move us towards equity is through narrowing and actually starting to prescribe the learning more and more. And they talk about, the learning left to chance. They don't want significant learning left to chance. We've all got to do the exact same powerful learning, and that will make us all equal. And in fact, it actually flies in the face of concepts of universal design for learning and even the understanding that we're a bicultural society, and actually different people need different things. They need to learn different things. And so I think on one hand, we have this argument going on in the background around canons of knowledge that are bizarrely traditional and narrow. And the argument is that we must all it's a move towards producing this, like students becoming products with the same thing, made up of the same components. They leave high school. And, part of the argument, and I don't even know if this comes from universities really, but part of the argument is that universities want to know that they can all write an essay and they can all do this and they can all do that. And it's like they take some of the basic concepts around literacy and numeracy and they sort of, they expand it out and out to determine that we have a responsibility to produce quite a standard product from our high school system. And actually that desire to move us towards a more prescribed curriculum flies in the face of our ability to provide creative responsive, flexible design. Like, I love our current NCEA framework. I would love to add to it and have more subjects and more standards and a bigger buffet that our teachers can select from and can tailor personalised learning pathways for our young people. Yet now, just when we have the technologies to more easily design these personalised pathways, they're pulling us back to fewer NCEA standards, narrower New Zealand curriculum design, which seems to be spelling out to educators that actually it should be more of a one-size-fits-all model of education. I don't understand it. I am so frustrated.
There's a thing in management which is what's measured is managed. And what that basically says is if you put in place a system where you're measuring achieve outcomes or whatever, somebody will want to make sure that they get more of the ones that they like and less of the ones that they don't like. The nasty twist to it, though, is that there seems to be a tension that says, yes, we got more of the ones we liked, but some of them were less important than the others. So we'll just take away those less important ones. So we get more of the ones that we really like. And then we'll take away the ones that are nice and we really like them, but there's some of them that we really, really like. So we'll only go for those ones. And you're constantly etching away at the bottom. And you're losing, every time you do that, you're becoming less equitable. You're becoming very standard. There's a former director of NZ/QA who came to one of these sector forums a while back. And honestly, his first speech to the sector about quality in higher education, tertiary education, was that as a former CEO in the dairy industry, he knew how to make really high quality cheese, and that all of that thinking about what it took to make high quality cheese could really just be applied really well to the education system. Yeah, let's just say that the cheese metaphors dominated discussion for the next couple of days. And there's unfortunately that model is really embedded there.
Problematic concept of what equitable outcomes means, and if we hung up on, the same time, I remember I actually walked away from the discussion on Twitter because I made a comment. I'm not a fan of event exams. I think they're totally problematic. I think there are much better ways that you can assess young people in their context, in the flow, in far more naturally occurring ways. But the argument of this other person on Twitter was that exams are the only equitable way to assess our young people because they're all sitting in the same conditions. And it's just like, no, that's the opposite of equity. And that's what we're working with. We're working with experts determining that equitable is the same rather than equitable actually being more diverse approaches to meet the needs of a greater number of people.
Yeah, I've made myself extraordinarily unpopular in my university by raging a campaign against exams. But I'm interested to see that the Provost Chancellor of Learning and Teaching at Waikato also raised this in a university-wide paper, making exactly the same point. If you simply take a step back and ask yourself, what is the purpose that we're trying to achieve as we educate people, and where are they going to enact learning? There are no exams in that space. Beyond that, there's no individual work in that space.
There's going to be a lot of resistance to any of that happening because, exams are easy. They're easy from an academics perspective when it comes to marking and
scalable.
and scalable and cheap. And it means they can focus on their other job, which is research and other outcomes. And so when the students are screaming, that's the only time we make changes at a university level in the way we design and deliver. And if they're not screaming, which given the way that the process is set up, it's really difficult to create red flags within the way that we deliver from students. Where's the need to change? And therefore that resistance from our institution, because they want easy, simple processes, and from our own teaching staff is quite marked in the fact that they really resist this and they want to stick with exams.
It's not just them though. So this is the thing that's the real problem. It's the parents, it's the students themselves, it's people in general, because of this legacy of a belief that the large consequential exam is how education enacts itself. And we seem to be incapable of engaging with that and explaining why we do assessment in the first place. I mean, most people are startled to discover that the university operated for many years without grades. In fact, it wasn't the fact that we even give people grades isn't inherent to the concept of higher education. It was purely introduced as an attempt to help the system scale into its role as a skills certification process, with a very manufacturing analogy aligned to that, into the needs of the employers, and it completely misses the point that in the modern world we have moved our tools into a new space. Everybody collaborates to get work done. Everyone draws on the internet and on our ability to access and manage and critique and use information. I was talking to someone earlier today who was making the point that one of our main challenges in the integrity issue, which is what exams are typically designed to try and solve, in quotes, is the fact that our students believe that learning consists of collecting content like it's shells on the seashore, and that the more you've got in your bucket, the more educated you are. And we have to be able to have a much more sophisticated conversation around the qualities of intellectually engaged, educated people in the future and their capacity to exercise agency. And this is where equality really starts to come out, is if we allow people to be themselves and to exercise themselves intellectually into a space as a peer, they can represent themselves in their communities and their cultures and their needs and perspectives far more effectively than a bureaucrat can do through some accountability instrument. And that's a real challenge for us.
I've been fighting for years that we step away from this concept of formal assessment, and actually that young people walk out of high schools with a portfolio that they can present however they like, and people sort of shudder because it's not divisible and measurable, and you can't easily compare one to the other. And interesting, I wrote a piece before the pandemic for Ideologue, imagining the education system 500 years in the future. And in that story, we went from our qualification framework to micro-credentials to nano-credentials to the point where we realised that we didn't actually need to measure them at all, because actually what mattered was the act of learning, and the learning being based on needs and skills. And interestingly, here at Albany Senior High School, every Wednesday is dedicated to impact projects, which we don't formally assess. And it is the best learning our young people participate in. They work with community groups, business groups, to solve a real life problem, to collaborate, connect, and to enact. And we still have parents contacting us about it being the non-learning day because we don't assess. It's sort of like the act of some sort of formal assessment is the only way that people know that learning has taken place. It's an extraordinary bind that we find ourselves in.
So the other thing that sits on my emails is a link to my book, which I explored some of these ideas, because there's a sociologist, a guy called Martin Troe, who worked in the 70s, who considered higher education and education systems generally as shifting between something that serves an elite audience, something that serves a mass audience that's very mainstream, and then something that's universal in its experience. And one of the ideas I unpacked in that was this concept that the mass system, which is where New Zealand tertiary education very much is at the moment, is very much defined on its economic rationalities, on its impact into the economic functions of society, because of the government's role as a funder of that, and consequentially the government's anxious responsibility to make sure that public money is used well and effectively. But when you move into the universal space, the focus shifts much more to the experience of the individual and the value that they directly perceive themselves from having done this thing. So learning, particularly for adults in the universal space, is a case of, in my life, I would like to know more about this, or I would like to be able to do these things well, or I would like to engage with these communities of people in a discussion and an exploration of this space. And how can I do things that allow me to be myself well in those ways? Now, some of them will be job skills and that your employer says, great, Stephen, you can now do that report so much better. But others will be things that are much more about identity construction. Now, the interesting thing about those is that assessment in those is not about accountability to somebody else. It's a tool for stimulating you to identify a strategy for improvement. The whole dynamic changes. Agency sits with the learner. You don't have to worry about integrity issues because if you do that, you're simply robbing yourself of something and you're the one that experiences that loss directly. Other people don't care because it's universal. Everybody's got it. So the fact that you've cheated to get something is pointless because you could have had it anyway. And I think for me, that's a real challenge for many societies as we start moving into that space, because some of the systems that have operated for better, for worse in the mass system really start to break down badly. And there's been examples of that, for example, in the United States around the collapse of Apollo education, the University of Phoenix Online, and the way that led to a collapse of the associate's degree in the US as a qualification under a mass education model, simply because everybody had it. And the problem is that you can see, and this is apparent in countries like South Korea, where the market fractures down and it stops being less that people have degrees, for example, but which university they got their degree from. And then we start re-entrenching privilege and inequality simply because the things that matter in life are differentially available to different people. And that often that knowledge is concealed from them. People don't have the social capital to realize that they're acting in a system where the dynamics of that system will never allow them to be successful. And this is something that Bourdieu, for example, talks about extensively. You have to be extraordinarily careful when you're trying to change a system to deal with issues of equality and inequality, to recognize that the view of the world is very different from different places.
Hey, it's great to hear three panelists linking global pandemic issue to challenges seamlessly, which is great. I don't have to ask the question, and also now linked to the assessment topic, which is one of the biggest or hottest topic in education. So on that note, I think some of you have covered this a little bit already, but there's one question in the chat about are creative approaches being explored towards inclusive and equitable approaches to assessing the achievement of learning outcomes? What do you think? Since we have been talking about no exam, formative assessment, summative assessment.
Sector, it has been, and it's getting better and better, but my fear is that the changes that are coming with the NCA change package are going to push us backwards, because what's happened over time is there's been less and less people are choosing to opt out of the exams because you can design a completely internally assessed program now with the current NCA framework. And that has resulted in people being creative, because we are starting to really understand the principles of universal design for learning, and we are starting to understand what it looks like when people have portfolios of learning, use mixed methods and modes for evidencing their learning, like at Albany Senior High School. The line I drew in the sand when I became principal here is that it had to be an absolute expectation that every assessment was designed to give students choice about context where possible, a choice around the mode through which they were being assessed, and they had the power to negotiate how and when they were assessed. And this upset the apple cart for a good year or so, but we're now finding our stride. But then comes along this NCA change packet where it's saying it's a 50-50 split between external and internal assessment. And whilst it's not necessarily exams in the external, it is prescribed. It is going to be prescribed what that looks like to a far greater degree. So I think in terms of a secondary context, we have been seeing really creative shifts, but that has upset the apple cart with those who were always very traditional through those who were winners in a far more traditional sector are getting nervous and actually pushing back And I think that's why we saw high schools rush back to reopen for exams, for instance, in our lockdown in Auckland, because there were some very noisy traditional voices that desperately wanted to get back to school because they're winners in the game of exams, and they wanted to make sure those conditions were available to their young people. So we have made headway. I worry that whenever we do make headway, that there are those in the system that get nervous and pull us back a bit.
Yeah.
We're certainly exploring what life might be like at Auckland University without exams, or with less high-stakes summative exams. But probably linking back to some of my previous comments, there's a lot of stakeholders involved in that, and those are internal. That's the institution and the processes that are easy and simple that kind of support that industry of assessment within the institution. We have the academic staff who are stakeholders who will resist because it's a change. It represents a change, and that change requires time and effort on their part. And I think even before we started the recording, I was talking about we have our external stakeholders like the Law Society, the Engineering Council, and all of those kind of professional degrees where they're also, as Stephen said earlier, I think, wanting a way to differentiate and understand the quality of a student based on what those students achieve through that exam process. And for them, that change would create quite a bit of trouble or problems for the way that they think about their profession.
Yeah. Anything to add? And I see Stephen put in chat. Is that what you would like to say?
Well, it's certainly a comment that has resonance with my academic colleagues. I think we've seen some really strong examples of this. We've seen when University of Melbourne tried to change its model of what an undergraduate degree experience would be, they were punished extensively by the market, by parents, by learners, by employers, and Monash University cleaned up by simply running a marketing campaign that basically said, "Ooh, Melbourne, that's a bit odd what they're doing over here. Come here, we'll do the nice, safe, traditional thing that you want out of the university, and there are no risks." And that actually seriously worked as a strategy. So that's a worry. We've also seen, and resonating with the winners under existing systems really resisting change. We've seen this come from learners. If you change models of assessment, for example, with medical students, you'll very rapidly get quite an aggressive pushback from students who, and we see this with law students as well, who believe that success is constructed in a very specific way. They've been successful that way, and don't you dare change that. Literally, we had, talking about exams and inclusion and support for different people, we introduced some technology. I know Auckland's using Inspira as a trial at the moment. We used it a couple of years ago. And the thing about Inspira is that we initially used it as a tool that allowed us to have devices coming into traditionally proctored, invigilated testing environments, so students could use keyboards, because our experience was basically that nobody uses pens anymore, and let alone us. Plus, people's handwriting was just becoming appalling. So the positive benefits of just being able to use a keyboard to write traditional essay response answers to tests are very obvious. We got a bunch of students coming back to us saying, "That's not fair. I tend to do better than my peers because I can write faster and more logically. If you let them use a keyboard, they'll be able to do better in the test than me, and I'll suffer." And it's just like, wow. How that, in terms of an equity and an inclusion challenge, there's a whole mindset in higher education that really drives us badly away from putting in place the changes that are going to be helpful. Coming back to the question, though, that Kwong Nui asked us, that comes from the chat from Jethro, I have real worries that come from my experience of sustainability of change in education systems and within institutions and within programs. And the problem that we face often with people who are really out there at the edge trying to help us understand how to do assessment better and create new ways of doing it, the problem is that if they don't bring their colleagues with them, if it's not integrated to a program view and a long-term strategy for where the teaching in that discipline and where that program is headed, I have seen virtually every single one of those initiatives lost the minute somebody switches focus. So they either have a different priority in their job, or they get moved out of that course and into another course. And all of that work is lost because the skills, the knowledge, the understanding of how to enact it are just not present in the colleagues that come into it. And whether or not they might want to do it, they simply struggle to understand how to enact something that is completely different to their experience. So there's really a capability development challenge there as well.
Yeah, I'd add to that as well. Like I saw Jethro's question around that we were focusing on exams and other, what are the other assessment strategies? I've been big on this focus on universal design for learning here at Albany Senior High School, and that has meant us really consciously designing assessment to give choice around the modes and the methods and the means that you assess them. But the trap that people often fall into is that they create an assessment and they say, look, evidence you're learning, you can do a podcast, you can do a, Erasmus sort of AI, thing. And then they don't teach young people how to use any of those platform tools or strategies, and then wonder why they just get a bunch of limp essays handed back into them. You're only going to see success in diverse approaches to assessment opportunities by teaching students how to engage with them, and actually teaching your teachers how to use the different platforms and tools and strategies. And so if you are going to go beyond the essay or beyond the exam, you need to be able to work with your teachers and your students about, like, podcasting is hugely powerful. Giving people the option to orally share their understanding is hugely powerful, and I have done a lot. I'm an English teacher by trade, and I'm an ex-HOD English, and I'm passionate about working with diverse learners. And, if you've got a dyslexic or dyspraxic or student or anyone that struggles with organising their words on a page, actually working with them to understand how to podcast or how to have different ways that they evidence their learning is hugely powerful, but only powerful if you teach them and support them to use those technologies and those tools. The other thing that I think is a real trap is that I often think educators don't know what they're assessing. When we talk about different subjects, quite often in English, for instance, you're not assessing how well a person can write. If you look at the achievement standard, if you look at it, you're supposed to be assessing how well the person understands the concepts or ideas and how well these link and inform other aspects of a text. More often than not, an educator will mark them on how well they can write. And it's utterly frustrating. So you're not going to get a shift in terms of more inclusive, creative, diverse assessment design until educators understand what it is they're actually assessing. I don't know if that's a problem in university, but I know it's...
Yes. Oh, yeah. Definitely.
Yeah. There's a huge focus, a skew towards what can you acquire? Show me what you've acquired in the content that I've shared this semester, not how can you analyze it, how can you leverage it, how can you use it to address different issues or problems that might arise that you haven't heard me talk about at the front of the lecture theatre. So it is a similar problem.
You measure learning through a discussion with a young person far more effectively. Often, if you're clear about what it is that you're actually assessing, a conversation is actually more powerful a lot of the time, because that unearths a lack of understanding and a lack of in-depth understanding really quickly.
Oh, all right.
Up and get a bit excited.
It's an exciting topic, isn't it? And I think we can keep going for another while, but I think time flies, and I think we are bent on time. So thank you very much, Claire, Steve, and Stephen, for your time and insightful sharing. And I'm sure all of us gained quite a lot of thoughts and ideas from today's sharing and discussion. And for those who would like to continue this discussion, feel free to connect with the speakers or with FLANZ. Thank you, everyone. And it's great to see so many people joining us today again. Thank you for this lunch hour. And once again, thank you, Claire, Steve, and Stephen. All the best. Stay safe, everyone, and kia kaha to those in Auckland.